Today we are going to discuss about a new speech, The Danger of a Single Story. Let's see what Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie tells us in her enlightening speech, The Danger of a Single Story. So in the speech, she tells us stereotypes and biases can affect our lives. Understanding cultural differences can help one see things from a different point of view and develop greater understanding. See her profile. Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, born September 50, 1977, is a Nigerian novelist, non-fiction writer, and short story writer. She is regarded as the most prominent among young Anglophone authors in African literature. Her works include Purple Hibiscus, Half of a Yellow Sun, and Americana. In the speech given by Adichie at a TED Talks, Adichie is a prolific Nigerian writer, and in this speech, she addresses the topic of singular narratives and how detrimental they can be to one's worldview. An important element of Adichie's speech in the simplicity of her language. She does not use extensive, difficult vocabulary. Instead, she uses anecdotes and her personal experience. The danger of a single story is simple and easy to understand, yet the impact is huge because of the powerful and relatable delivery. The main theme of her speech are stereotype and the incompleteness of one-sided portrayals. Opens her speech with a brief introduction. I am a storyteller and I would like to tell you a few personal stories about what I like to call the danger of a single story. I grew up on a university campus in eastern Nigeria. My mother says that I started reading at the age of 2, although I think it's probably happened when I was 4. So I was an early reader, and what I read were British and American children's books. I was also a early writer, and when I began to write at about the age of 7, stories in pencil with crayons, illustrations that my poor mother was obligated to read. I wrote exactly the kinds of stories I was reading. All my characters were white and blue eyed. They played in the snow. They ate apples and they talked a lot about the weather. How lovely it was that the sun had come out. But I had never been outside Nigeria. We did not have snow. We ate mangoes and we never talked about the weather because there were no need to. See in the two paragraphs, she compared her life with the others. So, what this shows, I think, is how impressionable and vulnerable we are in the face of a story, particularly as children, because all I had read were books in which characters were foreign. I had become convinced that books by their very nature and to have foreigners in them and had to be about things with which I could not personally identify. Now things changed when I discovered African books. There were not many of them available, and they were not quite as easy to find as the foreign books. When I read Chinua Achebe and Camera Live, I realized that people like me, girls with the skin color of chocolate, whose kiki hair could not form ponytails, could also exist in literature. I started to write about things I recognized. I loved the American and British books I read. They stirred my imagination and opened up new worlds for me. But African writers saved me from having a single story of what books are. From a conventional middle class Nigerian family, my father was a professor, my mother was an administrator, and so we had, as was the norm, live in domestic help, who would often come from nearby rural villages. So the year I turned 8, we got a new houseboy. His name was Faith. The only thing my mother told us about him was that his family was very poor. My mother sent yams and rice and our old clothes to his family. And when I did not finish my dinner, my mother would say, "Finish your food. Don't you know? People like Fi's family have nothing, so I felt enormous pity for Fi's family. Then, one Saturday, we went to his village to visit, and his mother showed us a beautiful patterned basket of dyed raffia that his brother had made. I was startled. It had not occurred to me that anybody in his family could actually make something. All I had heard about them was how poor they were, so that it had become impossible for me to see them as anything else but poor. The poverty was my single story of them. Years later, I thought about this when I left Nigeria to go to university in the United States. I was 90. My American roommate was shocked by me. She asked where I had learned to speak English so well and was confused when I said that Nigeria happened to have English as its official language. She asked if she could listen to what she called my tribal music and was consequently very disappointed when I produced my tap of Mariah Carey. She had felt sorry for me even before she saw me. Her default position towards me as an African was a kind of patronizing, well meaning pity. My roommates had a single story of Africa. In the single story, there were no possibility of Africans being similar to her in any way, no possibility of feelings more complex than pity, no possibility of a connection as human equals. I must say that before I went to the US, I did not consciously identify as African. But in the US, whenever African came up, people turned to me. I did come to embrace this new identity, and in many ways, I think of myself now as Africa, although I still get quite irritable when Africa is referred to as a country after I had spent some years in the US as an African. I began to understand my roommate's response to me if I had not grown up in Nigeria and if all I know about Africa were from popular images. I too would think that Africa was a place of beautiful landscapes, beautiful animals, and incomprehensible people unable to speak for themselves as waiting to be saved by a kind white foreigners. I would see Africans in the same way that I, as a child, and seen Faith family. I began to realize that my American roommates must have throughout her life seen and heard different versions of the single story. A professor once told me that my novel was not authentically African. I did not know what African authenticity was. The professor told me that my characters were too much like him, an educated and middle class man. My characters drove cars. They were not starving. Therefore, they were not authentically African. When I learned some years ago that writers were expected to have had really unhappy childhoods to be successful, I began to think about how I could invent horrible things my parents had done to me. But the truth is that I had a very happy childhood, full of laughter and love, in a very close knit family. But I also had grandfathers who died in refugees camps. My cousin's Paul died because he could not get adequate health care. One of my closest friend, Okoloma, died in a plane crash because our fire trucks did not have water. I grew up under repressive military government that devalued education so that sometimes my parents were not paid the salaries. All of these stories make me who I am. But to insist of only these negative stories is to flatten my experiences and to overlook the many the stories that formed me. The single story creates stereotype, and the problem with a stereotype is not that they are untrue, but that they are incomplete. They make one story become the only story. The overall idea about this speech is the danger of a single story is a concept that warns us about the problems of only hearing or believing one perspective or stereotype about a group of people, a place, or an idea. Imagine if you only heard some story about a country like Africa being poor and full of problems. This can lead to misunderstandings and unfair judgment. It's important to listen to many different stories and perspectives to have a more complete and accurate understanding of the world. This way, we can avoid unfair judgments and stereotypes and have a more inclusive and open minded view of things.